Before we dive in, pause for a moment and tell me something. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Maybe it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. Don't just watch quietly. Drop a comment below and let's see how far this story reaches across the world. Now, lean in, and let's begin. Lucien Moreau stood frozen in the doorway of his cabin, watching his new bride Isabella strip away the facade that had fooled him for 6 months. Her delicate hands removing layers of powder and paint to reveal skin bronzed by desert sun while she spoke in fluent Apache to warriors who'd emerged from the darkness like avenging spirits. The woman he'd married for her father's vast ranch holdings was not the helpless Spanish heiress she'd claimed to be, but someone whose true identity would make their union the most dangerous mistake of his life. Her transformation from fragile flower to fierce warrior woman was happening before his eyes as she donned traditional Apache dress and war paint that revealed her as daughter of the most feared chief in Arizona territory. The marriage contract that had seemed like his salvation from bankruptcy now felt like his death warrant, because Isabella's real name was Aiyana, and her father was Chief Nalnish, whose hatred for white settlers had been legendary even before Lucien had unknowingly married into the family, whose warriors had been fighting a brutal war against everything he represented. The land he'd thought he was inheriting through marriage actually belonged to people who'd been murdered to make way for cattle ranchers like himself, while the fortune he'd believed would save his failing ranch was blood money paid to compensate for genocide that couldn't be undone through legal documents or marriage ceremonies. The Apache warriors surrounding his cabin were not raiders or random attackers, but relatives who'd come to collect a bride whose mission had been completed with devastating success. Aiyana's explanation of how she'd infiltrated white society by posing as the orphaned daughter of a dead Spanish landowner was delivered with pride that made her deception seem like a military victory rather than personal betrayal. Every moment of tenderness they'd shared, every word of love she'd whispered, every promise of future happiness had been calculated manipulation designed to gain access to information about territorial defenses and settler vulnerabilities that would be used to plan attacks against innocent families. The realization that he'd been sleeping beside an enemy spy for months while believing himself to be falling in love with someone who returned his affections was almost too overwhelming to process rationally. The gentle woman who'd nursed him through fever, cooked his meals, and shared his bed had been gathering intelligence that would be used to kill his neighbors and destroy the communities that had welcomed her as one of their own. His marriage had made him an unwitting traitor to his own people, while his growing love for someone who'd never existed had blinded him to dangers that now threatened everyone he'd ever cared about. The choice Aiyana offered him was simple and terrible. Join her people in their war against white expansion into Apache territory, or die with the settlers whose destruction had been planned using information she'd gathered during their months of false marriage. The woman he'd married for land was giving him the opportunity to choose between his race and his wife, between survival and honor, between love and loyalty to everything he'd believed about civilization and progress. As Apache war cries echoed through the desert night and flames began to flicker in the distance where neighboring ranches were being attacked, Lucien faced the most impossible decision of his life while staring into the eyes of someone he'd loved completely but had never known at all. 3 months before his world collapsed, Lucien had been facing bankruptcy that would cost him the ranch his father had built through 20 years of brutal frontier labor, his cattle operation failing due to drought, Apache raids, and debts that were growing faster than his ability to service them through honest work. The mortgage payments to the territorial bank had become impossible to meet, while the cost of replacing livestock lost to raiders and disease had consumed what little cash remained from selling his mother's jewelry and his father's prized horses. The choice between losing everything his family had built or finding a financial miracle seemed like no choice at all. The introduction to Isabella Vásquez had come through Father Miguel at the mission in Tucson. The priest's suggestion that the grieving Spanish heiress might benefit from marriage to a stable rancher, presented as charity rather than business arrangement that would solve both their problems. Her story was heartbreaking and convincing. Orphaned when Apache raiders had killed her family and destroyed their magnificent estate, she'd been left with land grants and legal claims worth a fortune, but needed a husband's protection to enforce her rights in territorial courts that didn't recognize women's independent ownership of vast properties. Their courtship had been formal and brief, conducted under Father Miguel's watchful supervision, with conversations that focused on practical arrangements rather than romantic emotions that neither claimed to feel for the other. Isabella's beauty was undeniable but seemed fragile and ethereal, her pale skin and delicate features suggesting someone who'd been protected from frontier hardships by wealth and social position that most territorial women never experienced. Her education was evident in her perfect English and knowledge of literature, while her musical talents and artistic abilities marked her as someone whose background included luxuries that frontier life rarely provided. The marriage ceremony itself had been a small affair, attended only by Father Miguel and a few neighboring ranchers who served as witnesses to legal documents that would transfer Isabella's extensive landholdings to her new husband's control. The contracts were complex and detailed, specifying that Isabella's inheritance would become Lucien's property upon their marriage, while ensuring that she would be provided for comfortably regardless of how their relationship developed over time. The arrangement seemed fair and beneficial to both parties, solving his financial crisis while giving her the male protection that territorial law required for claiming her inheritance. The wedding night had been awkward but tender, with Isabella's obvious inexperience balanced by genuine affection that seemed to be growing between them despite the practical origins of their union. Her gratitude for his protection was expressed through small kindnesses and domestic skills that made their cabin more comfortable and welcoming than it had been during his years of bachelor solitude. The partnership they were building felt like it might evolve into something deeper than mere convenience, making Lucien hope that their marriage of necessity might become a love story worthy of the frontier couples whose relationships had survived every hardship the territory could impose on people brave enough to build lives together in dangerous places. The months following their marriage had been the happiest of Lucien's adult life, with Isabella transforming his rough bachelor quarters into a home that reflected feminine touches he'd never realized he'd been missing during years of solitary existence on a ranch that had demanded all his attention and energy. Her cooking was exceptional, her company was pleasant, and her obvious efforts to learn ranch management and frontier survival skills suggested genuine commitment to their partnership that went beyond mere legal obligation. The woman who'd seemed so fragile during their courtship was revealing practical competence that made her invaluable as both wife and business partner. Her interest in territorial politics and Apache relations had seemed natural for someone whose family had been killed in raids, her questions about military patrols and settler defenses reflecting understandable concern for their safety rather than suspicious curiosity about information that could be used against the people she'd married into. Lucien had been happy to share everything he knew about territorial affairs, from the locations of water sources and supply routes to the schedules of cavalry patrols and the defensive capabilities of various settlements. Her intelligence and memory for details had impressed him, making their conversations more interesting than he'd expected from someone whose background had been so different from his own. The social acceptance Isabella had gained among their neighbors had enhanced Lucien's standing in the community, her beauty and refined manners making other ranch wives eager to include her in their activities, while her obvious devotion to her husband earned approval from men who respected the domestic harmony she'd brought to the Moreau ranch. The dinner parties she organized became popular social events that strengthened relationships with neighboring families, while her charitable work with mission orphans and her assistance to women whose husbands had been killed in Apache raids made her beloved throughout the territory as someone whose goodness was matched by her practical helpfulness. The physical intimacy that had developed between them had been gradual but passionate, with Isabella's initial shyness giving way to enthusiasm that made their relationship feel like a genuine love match rather than merely a business arrangement between strangers seeking mutual benefit. Her presence in his bed had made the long winter nights something to anticipate rather than endure. While her obvious pleasure in their physical relationship had convinced him that her feelings for him were becoming as real as his growing love for her. The connection between them seemed to deepen with each passing week, making him grateful for the financial crisis that had forced him to seek a wife. But the most significant change Isabella had brought to his life was hope for a future that extended beyond mere survival to encompass dreams of prosperity and family that had seemed impossible during his years of struggling alone against obstacles that had defeated so many other ranchers. Her inheritance would provide the capital needed to expand their operation, while her obvious intelligence and business sense would make her a valuable partner in building something lasting that could be passed down to the children they'd begun discussing as possibilities rather than distant dreams. The marriage that had begun as desperate expediency was evolving into partnership that promised happiness he'd never imagined possible in the harsh realities of territorial life, where most couples considered themselves fortunate if they simply survived long enough to see their children reach adulthood. The first signs that something was wrong with Isabella's carefully constructed identity appeared in small inconsistencies that Lucien noticed but initially dismissed as nervous mistakes from someone still adjusting to frontier life that was dramatically different from her privileged upbringing. Her knowledge of Apache language and customs seemed too detailed for someone whose only contact with them had been the traumatic raid that had killed her family, while her familiarity with desert survival techniques suggested experience that didn't match her story of growing up in protected luxury. The questions she asked about territorial defenses were becoming more specific and tactical, going beyond reasonable concern for their safety to encompass details that would be more useful for planning attacks than preventing them. The discovery of strange symbols drawn in the dirt behind their cabin was explained as nervous doodling, but the patterns looked suspiciously like Apache communication signs that Lucien had learned to recognize during his years of fighting raiders who used such markings to coordinate movements and share information about targets. Isabella's explanation that she'd picked up random symbols during her captivity after the raid seemed reasonable, but her obvious discomfort when he asked about their meaning suggested that her knowledge was more extensive and purposeful than casual observation would have provided. The visitors who began appearing at their ranch were introduced as distant relatives and family friends who'd survived the same raid that had orphaned Isabella, but their appearances and behaviors didn't match the Spanish heritage they claimed to share with his wife. Their skin was darker than most Europeans. Their familiarity with horses and weapons suggested military rather than civilian backgrounds, and their conversations with Isabella included words and phrases that sounded more like Apache dialect than Spanish. The meetings were always brief and conducted privately, with explanations that focused on business matters related to her inheritance rather than social visits that would be expected among family members reuniting after traumatic separation. The territorial newspaper reports about increased Apache activity in areas where Isabella had claimed to have property holdings created disturbing patterns that suggested coordination between her presence in various communities and subsequent raids that targeted the same military supply routes and settlement defenses she'd been asking about during their conversations. The timing was too consistent to be coincidental, while the precision of the attacks indicated intelligence gathering that went beyond what random scouting could provide. Lucien began to suspect that his wife was somehow connected to Apache operations, though the possibility that she was actually working with them seemed too impossible to believe. The breaking point came when he discovered letters written in what appeared to be coded Spanish, but contained Apache symbols mixed throughout the text, hidden in Isabella's sewing basket among materials that she claimed were patterns for clothing and household items. The correspondence was addressed to names he'd never heard her mention, while the content discussed military movements and settlement vulnerabilities with tactical precision that matched intelligence reports he'd seen during his service with territorial militia. As he confronted the evidence that his beloved wife was not who she claimed to be, Lucien faced the terrifying possibility that the woman he'd married for her land was actually an enemy agent whose mission was to destroy everything he'd spent his life building and protecting. The confrontation that would shatter Lucien's world began when he found Isabella burning papers in their fireplace. Her frantic efforts to destroy evidence, creating suspicions that could no longer be ignored or explained away through trust and love that had been built on foundations of systematic deception. The fragments he managed to save from the flames contained enough Apache symbols and territorial intelligence to prove that his wife had been conducting espionage operations throughout their marriage, using their home as a base for gathering information that was being passed to hostile forces that had killed his friends and neighbors. The confession he extracted through desperate questioning revealed the scope of her deception, with Isabella's admission that she was actually Aiyana, daughter of Chief Nulnish, delivered with dignity that made her betrayal seem like military duty rather than personal cruelty. Her explanation of how she'd been trained from childhood to infiltrate white settlements by assuming false identities was delivered without apology or shame, her pride in successfully completing such a dangerous mission evident even as she acknowledged that discovery would mean death for both of them if her people believed she'd been compromised beyond redemption. The details of her infiltration were staggering in their complexity and duration, with years of preparation that had included learning Spanish language and customs, acquiring forged documents that established her false identity, and developing social connections that would make her acceptable to frontier communities that were naturally suspicious of strangers. Her adoption of European dress and mannerisms had been so complete that even experienced Indian fighters had been fooled by her performance, while her romantic manipulation of his emotions had been calculated to ensure his cooperation in providing access to sensitive information about territorial defenses. The revelation that their marriage had been her assignment rather than her choice was delivered with matter-of-fact precision that made clear she'd never experienced genuine emotions for him, despite months of apparent intimacy and affection that had convinced him of her love. Every tender moment they'd shared had been professional performance designed to maintain her cover while extracting maximum intelligence value from their relationship, making him question his ability to distinguish between authentic and artificial emotions in someone whose training had included techniques for manipulating lonely men who were desperate for companionship and validation. But the most devastating aspect of her confession was her admission that the information she'd gathered during their marriage had been used to plan raids that had killed people they'd socialized with, making him an unwitting accomplice in the deaths of neighbors who'd welcomed her into their community as his beloved wife. The dinner parties she'd organized and the charitable work she'd performed had been opportunities for reconnaissance rather than genuine efforts to contribute positively to the society she was secretly working to destroy. As Aiyana revealed the true purpose of their relationship, while Apache war cries echoed in the distance, Lucien understood that he'd been living with an enemy whose mission was nearly complete and whose people were already implementing plans that would destroy everything he'd spent his life building and protecting. The transformation of Lucien's cabin into an Apache command center happened with military efficiency that revealed how thoroughly Aiyana had been preparing for this moment throughout their marriage. Her careful selection of their home's location providing strategic advantages that now served her people's war planning rather than the domestic happiness he'd believed they were building together. The warriors who emerged from hiding places around his property had been positioned for weeks, their presence undetected despite his years of experience fighting Apache raiders who'd taught him to recognize signs of hostile surveillance that had apparently evolved beyond his ability to detect. Chief Nalnish's arrival was announced by war drums that echoed across the desert, with rhythms that communicated messages about territorial violations and blood debts that could only be settled through violence that would restore balance to lands stolen through treaties that had never been honored by white settlers whose promises were worthless when measured against their actions. The chief's presence transformed the remote ranch into neutral ground, where enemies could meet under temporary truce that would end when decisions were made about Lucien's fate and role in conflicts that had been raging since his people had first crossed Apache boundaries with intentions that had never included peaceful coexistence. The war council that convened in his own living room was conducted in Apache language that Lucien understood enough to recognize discussions about supply routes, military strengths, and settlement vulnerabilities that Aiyana had documented during their marriage. The maps she produced from hiding places throughout their home showed detailed intelligence about territorial defenses that had been gathered through months of careful observation disguised as innocent curiosity about her new homeland. Every question she'd asked, every social gathering she'd organized, every charitable mission she'd undertaken had been designed to collect information that was now being used to plan coordinated attacks against every community that had welcomed her as Lucien's wife. The tactical discussions that followed revealed the scope of Apache planning that went far beyond random raids to encompass systematic warfare designed to drive white settlers from traditional hunting grounds that had been occupied through legal fiction that ignored indigenous rights predating territorial government by centuries. The intelligence Aiyana had provided would enable strikes against military patrols, supply convoys, and isolated settlements with precision that would maximize casualties while minimizing Apache losses in campaigns designed to make continued white presence too costly to sustain through normal military responses. But the most chilling aspect of the War Council was the debate about Lucien's fate, with some warriors arguing for immediate execution, while others suggested that his forced participation in their cause might provide additional intelligence value that could be exploited through psychological pressure and threats against communities he'd grown up protecting. Chief Nalnish's decision would determine whether he would be killed as an enemy, recruited as an unwilling ally, or preserved as a hostage, whose value might increase as territorial authorities realized how completely their defenses had been compromised by an infiltration operation that had succeeded beyond anything they'd believed possible. As Aiyana translated her father's questions about his willingness to choose survival over loyalty to people who'd never accepted him as anything more than useful cannon fodder in their war against Apache independence, Lucien faced decisions that would define not just his survival, but his identity as someone whose honor could be purchased through threats that made cowardice seem like wisdom. The ultimatum delivered by Chief Nalnish was deceptively simple. Either Lucien would assist Apache raids by providing ongoing intelligence about territorial military responses and settler defensive preparations, or he would be executed as an enemy whose death would send a message about the price of occupying Apache lands without permission that would never be granted through negotiations with governments that lacked authority to cede property that had never belonged to them. The choice between collaboration and death was presented without emotion or consideration for personal relationships that had developed between his daughter and the white man, whose cooperation could prove valuable if properly motivated through combinations of reward and threat. Aiyana's translation of her father's offer included details about the benefits of cooperation that went beyond mere survival to encompass wealth and status among Apache people who valued intelligence and bravery above ethnic heritage when evaluating potential allies in their struggle against numerical odds that made every advantage precious regardless of its source. Lucien's knowledge of white culture, military tactics, and territorial politics could make him invaluable as advisor and strategist if he chose to embrace his role as son-in-law to someone whose leadership had kept Apache independence alive despite overwhelming pressure from federal forces that had destroyed most other tribal resistance to American expansion. The alternative to cooperation was demonstrated through graphic descriptions of tortures that would precede his death, with Apache traditions requiring that enemies suffer proportional punishment for the pain they'd inflicted on indigenous people through participation in genocidal policies that had driven tribes from ancestral lands into reservations that were designed to eliminate native culture through forced assimilation or gradual starvation. The methods described were calculated to break his resolve, while illustrating that mercy was not an option being offered to someone whose people had shown no compassion for Apache families destroyed by military campaigns that had targeted women and children as legitimate casualties in wars against civilizations that threatened American concepts of progress and manifest destiny. The psychological pressure of choosing between survival and honor was intensified by Aiyana's obvious pain at translating threats against someone she'd grown to care for, despite the professional nature of their relationship. Her divided loyalties creating emotional complications that hadn't been anticipated when her mission was planned by leaders who'd assumed that personal feelings wouldn't interfere with military objectives. Her transformation from Isabella the Spanish heiress to Aiyana the Apache princess was incomplete as long as she retained emotional connections to the enemy she'd been ordered to manipulate, making her reliability questionable if circumstances required choosing between duty to her people and protection of feelings that were compromising her effectiveness as an intelligence operative. The deadline for his decision was set for dawn, giving Lucien one night to choose between everything he'd believed about civilization and morality versus survival that would require abandoning communities that had welcomed him as neighbor and defender throughout his adult life. The choice was complicated by understanding that his information could save Apache lives while causing deaths among settlers whose only crime was seeking prosperity in territories that legal documents claimed had been legitimately purchased from previous owners who'd possessed no authority to sell lands that belonged to people who'd never agreed to any transfer of ownership. As darkness fell over a desert that would soon become a battlefield, where his decision would help determine which side possessed advantages that might prove decisive in conflicts that had been inevitable since white settlers had first crossed boundaries that had been established through divine mandate rather than human negotiation. Lucien faced the most important decision of his life while staring into eyes that held both love and duty in combinations that made them impossible to read or understand. The hours of darkness that followed Chief Nalnisha's ultimatum were the longest of Lucien's life. Spent pacing the confines of his own cabin while Apache guards ensured that escape attempts would be fatal and reflection would be undisturbed by possibilities that no longer existed for someone whose choices had been reduced to collaboration or death, with no alternatives offered by enemies who'd been generous beyond their usual practices in providing opportunities for survival that honored his relationship with Aiyana while acknowledging practical benefits that his cooperation might provide for their cause. The conversation he shared with Aiyana during those desperate hours revealed complexities in her character that made her both more human and more dangerous than the simple enemy spy he'd believed her to be after discovering her true identity. Her genuine affection for him, balanced against loyalties to people whose survival depended on intelligence that only his cooperation could provide in sufficient detail to ensure success. Her admission that their relationship had evolved beyond professional necessity into emotional attachment that complicated her ability to function as purely an operative created hope that love might influence her father's decision about his fate, while simultaneously making her less trustworthy as an ally if circumstances required choosing between conflicting loyalties. The moral complexity of his situation was staggering, because cooperation would make him directly responsible for deaths of innocent settlers whose only crime was seeking better lives in territories that legal documents claimed were available for homesteading, while refusal would accomplish nothing beyond personal martyrdom that would have no impact on Apache plans that would proceed with or without his assistance. The information he possessed could save Apache lives by helping them avoid military traps and coordinated responses that would turn their raids into disasters. But the same intelligence would enable attacks against communities that had welcomed him as protector and neighbor throughout his adult life in frontier regions where survival depended on mutual support among people facing common threats. The spiritual dimension of his crisis involved questioning everything he'd believed about civilization, progress, and the righteousness of American expansion into territories that had been inhabited by indigenous peoples whose claims predated European arrival by centuries, but were dismissed by legal systems that recognized only written documents rather than traditional relationships between tribes and lands that had sustained them through countless generations. The Apache cause was morally defensible even if their methods were brutal. While white settlement was legally justified, even though it was built on foundations of theft and genocide that were disguised through political rhetoric about manifest destiny and civilizing influences that improved territories through agricultural development and commercial activity. As dawn approached with the inevitability of death or dishonor, Lucien found himself examining not just his immediate choice between survival and loyalty, but fundamental questions about identity and belonging that went to the heart of what it meant to be human in circumstances where moral clarity was impossible and all available options required compromising principles that had previously seemed absolute and non-negotiable. The man who'd married for land was discovering that ownership itself was a concept that different cultures understood in ways that couldn't be reconciled through legal documents or military force, making his personal crisis a microcosm of larger conflicts that had been tearing apart the American frontier since white settlement had begun displacing indigenous peoples whose rights were ignored by governments that derived their authority from concepts of sovereignty that excluded the original inhabitants of territories being claimed through conquest disguised as legal purchase. The decision Lucien made as sunrise painted the desert mountains red was delivered with quiet dignity that surprised even Chief Nalnish. His acceptance of Apache alliance offered not from cowardice, but from recognition that survival required choosing between competing definitions of honor that had been shaped by different cultural values and historical experiences that couldn't be reconciled through moral absolutes that ignored practical realities about power and justice in territories where law was determined by whoever possessed superior force rather than superior arguments. His agreement to provide intelligence about territorial defenses was conditional on guarantees that Apache raids would focus on military targets rather than innocent civilians, a demand that revealed he still retained hope that honor could be preserved even while switching sides in a war where both armies had committed atrocities that violated every standard of civilized behavior. The ceremony that formalized his adoption into Aiyana's band was conducted with rituals that had been performed for centuries to welcome warriors whose loyalty had been proven through sacrifice and commitment that transcended ethnic boundaries to encompass shared dedication to protecting Apache freedom against enemies whose numerical advantages could only be overcome through superior intelligence and tactical coordination. The scarification that marked his face as a member of Chief Nalnish's family was painful but symbolically necessary, creating permanent visible evidence of choices that couldn't be undone if circumstances changed and second thoughts developed about the wisdom of abandoning his people for survival among enemies who would execute him immediately if his loyalty was ever questioned or his usefulness ended. The intelligence briefing that followed his formal acceptance as Apache ally required him to reveal everything he knew about territorial military operations, supply routes, patrol schedules, and defensive capabilities that had been developed specifically to counter Apache raids that were becoming increasingly sophisticated as tribal leaders learned from previous encounters with federal forces. His knowledge of white culture and psychology provided insights that enabled Apache strategists to predict settler responses to various types of attacks, while his familiarity with territorial politics helped them understand decision-making processes that determined how resources would be allocated for military campaigns designed to eliminate Apache resistance through superior firepower and coordinated tactics. The planning session that utilized his information to design upcoming raids was both fascinating and horrifying, revealing Apache military capabilities that far exceeded what territorial authorities understood about enemy forces. They'd consistently underestimated throughout conflicts that had been characterized by American overconfidence and cultural blindness that prevented recognition of indigenous strategic thinking that was adapted to terrain and circumstances that white military doctrine ignored. The precision with which Apache leaders coordinated movements across vast distances using communication methods that were invisible to enemy scouts demonstrated organizational sophistication that challenged every assumption about primitive warfare that had shaped federal military policy since the Indian Wars had begun decades earlier. But the most disturbing aspect of his transformation from settler to Apache ally was the realization that his new role made perfect sense from perspectives that prioritized survival over abstract principles about racial loyalty and national identity that had been constructed to serve political purposes rather than individual needs for meaning and belonging in circumstances where traditional sources of guidance were unavailable or inadequate. The marriage that had begun as financial necessity was evolving into cultural bridge between communities that had been taught to view each other as irredeemable enemies, making Lucien and Aiyana symbols of possibilities that most people on both sides would consider treasonous betrayals of everything their respective peoples had fought and died to preserve or achieve through warfare that had consumed too many lives while resolving nothing about fundamental conflicts over land use and sovereignty that couldn't be settled through violence alone. The attack on Fort Davidson began before dawn with precision that demonstrated how completely Lucien's intelligence had transformed Apache tactical capabilities. His detailed knowledge of garrison schedules and defensive weaknesses, enabling strikes that bypassed every countermeasure that had been developed through years of bitter experience, fighting raids that had previously been characterized by brave but ultimately futile frontal assaults against superior firepower. The diversionary attacks that drew soldiers away from critical positions were timed to create maximum confusion, while Apache infiltration teams eliminated sentries and captured weapons that would be used to escalate the conflict beyond anything territorial authorities had prepared to handle. Lucien's role in the operation was limited to observation and communication, his position allowing him to witness the effectiveness of intelligence that had been purchased through betrayal of everything he'd previously believed about loyalty and honor, while simultaneously providing evidence that Apache military capabilities had been consistently underestimated by federal forces whose racial prejudices had prevented accurate assessment of enemy strengths and tactical sophistication. The soldiers who died during the raid were men he'd shared drinks with during social visits to the fort, making their deaths feel like personal responsibility, even though his information had been used to minimize casualties on both sides through precise targeting that eliminated resistance without requiring prolonged fighting. The capture of military supplies and weapons during the raid provided Apache forces with resources that would enable them to conduct larger and more ambitious operations throughout the territory. While the psychological impact of such a successful attack against a major federal installation would demonstrate to other tribes that organized resistance was still possible, despite overwhelming odds against indigenous peoples who'd been written off as defeated remnants incapable of meaningful opposition to American expansion. The symbolic value of defeating white military forces using intelligence provided by a converted settler would inspire Apache recruitment, while undermining settler confidence in their own security throughout regions where isolation made communities vulnerable to coordinated attacks. The aftermath of the raid required Lucien to process the emotional cost of watching friends and former neighbors being killed or wounded by strategies that couldn't have succeeded without his participation. making him directly responsible for American casualties in ways that couldn't be rationalized through arguments about Apache rights or white injustices that provided moral justification for switching sides in conflicts where abstract principles offered little comfort when measured against concrete human suffering. The guilt he experienced was balanced by understanding that his cooperation had actually reduced bloodshed by enabling surgical strikes instead of prolonged battles that would have resulted in higher casualties among both Apache raiders and American defenders who'd been outmaneuvered rather than simply overwhelmed through superior numbers. But the most disturbing aspect of the operation's success was his growing realization that military intelligence was only the beginning of what Apache leaders expected from his collaboration, with future operations requiring him to participate more actively in raids that would test his commitment to his new allegiances while providing additional evidence of loyalty that couldn't be questioned by warriors who remained suspicious of converts whose motivations might be compromised by emotional attachments to enemy communities they'd abandoned for survival rather than genuine conviction about Apache cause. As Chief Nalnish began planning raids that would require Lucien's direct participation in combat against federal forces, the man who'd betrayed his people for love and survival faced the prospect of becoming a warrior in conflicts that would make his transformation from settler to Apache complete and irreversible, regardless of how circumstances might change or conscience might eventually reassert itself. The order to participate in the raid against his former neighbors in Silver Creek came 6 weeks after Fort Davidson, marking Chief Nalnish's decision that Lucien's loyalty needed to be proven through actions that would eliminate any possibility of return to white society, even if capture or changing circumstances made such retreats seem attractive in the future. The target was the settlement where he'd been born and raised, where his parents were buried, and where people had known him since childhood as someone whose character and reliability had never been questioned, until his mysterious disappearance following what authorities assumed had been an Apache attack that had claimed his life along with his wife's. The intelligence he was required to provide about Silver Creek's defenses included intimate knowledge of every building, every family, and every potential hiding place that could shelter resistance fighters during coordinated assaults designed to capture rather than destroy a community whose strategic location made it valuable as Apache base for controlling travel routes throughout the territory. His information about which residents possessed military experience and which families included children too young to pose threats would enable precise tactical decisions that minimized casualties while maximizing psychological impact on surviving settlers who would spread word about Apache capabilities that exceeded anything federal authorities had prepared to counter. The personal cost of planning attacks against people who'd been his friends, neighbors, and surrogate family since his parents' deaths was almost unbearable. But refusal would mean immediate execution while accomplishing nothing to protect people whose fate had been decided by strategic considerations that went far beyond individual feelings or moral qualms about targeting civilians in warfare that had been characterized by atrocities on both sides since the conflicts had begun. Aiyana's support during his emotional struggle provided comfort that was complicated by understanding that her loyalty to Apache cause would always supersede personal feelings if circumstances required choosing between military objectives and his survival. The cultural education that accompanied his military training revealed aspects of Apache society that challenged every assumption he'd developed about indigenous peoples during his upbringing in communities that had viewed Indians as primitive obstacles to progress rather than complex civilizations with sophisticated political structures and moral systems that were different from, but not inferior to, European traditions. The wisdom of elders who'd witnessed decades of conflict with white settlers provided perspectives on territorial disputes that were based on historical experiences and spiritual beliefs that couldn't be dismissed as superstition by anyone who'd observed Apache tactical sophistication and organizational capabilities firsthand. But the most significant aspect of his transformation was the gradual acceptance among Apache warriors who'd initially viewed him as useful, but ultimately expendable ally, whose white heritage made him permanently suspect regardless of how many battles he fought or how much intelligence he provided for operations against his former people. The respect he earned through demonstrated competence and genuine commitment to Apache survival created bonds that transcended racial boundaries while establishing his identity as warrior whose worth was measured by contributions to collective security rather than ethnic purity or cultural conformity that had characterized his previous community membership among settlers who'd accepted him because of family connections rather than individual merit. The raid on Silver Creek began with Lucien's infiltration of the settlement during a community celebration, his familiar face allowing him to move freely among people who welcomed him as a survivor of the Apache attack that had supposedly claimed his life months earlier. Their joy at his return, mixed with curiosity about his wife's fate and the circumstances of his escape from captivity that had clearly changed him in ways that went beyond physical hardship to encompass psychological transformation that was evident in his eyes and bearing. The questions they asked about his experiences were answered with carefully crafted lies that concealed his true role while gathering final intelligence about defensive preparations and resident capabilities that would determine tactical approaches when Apache forces launched their coordinated assault. The emotional weight of deceiving people who'd raised him after his parents' deaths was almost overwhelming. But the knowledge that his information would enable surgical strikes rather than indiscriminate slaughter provided moral justification for betrayal that served humanitarian purposes even while violating every principle of loyalty and honor that had been instilled during his upbringing in communities that valued trustworthiness above all other virtues. The children who ran to greet him with innocent excitement had no idea they were embracing someone whose presence guaranteed their community's destruction, while the adults who offered shelter and food were unknowingly hosting an enemy spy whose gratitude was genuine, even though his mission was unchanged. The signal that triggered the Apache attack was delivered through mirror flashes that reflected moonlight in patterns that communicated tactical information about target locations and defensive positions that had been observed during his reconnaissance mission, making him directly responsible for coordinating strikes that eliminated resistance before it could organize effectively against superior numbers and battlefield experience. The precision with which Apache warriors moved through familiar streets demonstrated how thoroughly his intelligence had been incorporated into operational plans that treated his childhood home as enemy territory, requiring military occupation rather than friendly community deserving protection from hostile forces. The battle that followed was characterized by restraint that exceeded anything previously seen in Apache raids, with specific orders to capture rather than kill civilians whose survival would serve propaganda purposes while demonstrating Apache capability for mercy that white military forces had rarely shown during campaigns against indigenous peoples throughout territorial history. The selective targeting of military-age males and community leaders reflected strategic thinking that prioritized long-term psychological impact over immediate tactical advantage, while protection of women and children provided evidence of moral superiority that would complicate federal responses to Apache victories that couldn't be dismissed as savage brutality. But the most devastating moment of the operation came when Lucien was required to personally arrest Sheriff Morrison, the man who'd taught him to ride and shoot and had served as father figure since his parents' deaths. The recognition in the old lawman's eyes revealing understanding that his adopted son had chosen survival over loyalty while transforming from victim to victimizer in conflicts that had claimed too many innocent lives on both sides. The disappointment and betrayal evident in Sheriff Morrison's expression was more painful than any physical torture could have been, marking the complete destruction of relationships that had defined Lucien's identity and moral foundation throughout his formative years in communities that had shaped his character through examples of courage and integrity that he was now violating through choices that prioritized personal survival over communal responsibility. The captured settlers from Silver Creek were held in a canyon fortress that had been used by Apache peoples for centuries as refuge during periods when their survival depended on defensive positions that couldn't be located or besieged by enemy forces lacking intimate knowledge of desert terrain and water sources that sustained life in regions where most white travelers died within days of losing their way. The prisoners' treatment was humane by frontier standards, but psychologically devastating for people whose worldview had been shaped by assumptions about Apache savagery that were being contradicted by evidence of organizational sophistication and moral restraint that exceeded what they'd experienced from their own military forces during territorial campaigns. Lucien's role as translator and cultural intermediary required him to facilitate communications between captured neighbors and Apache leaders whose decisions about prisoner exchange and release would be influenced by information about territorial military responses and federal willingness to negotiate rather than simply escalate conflicts through retaliatory raids that had characterized previous interactions between indigenous peoples and white authorities. His position was uniquely painful because both sides trusted him to accurately represent their interests, while neither fully understood the emotional cost of serving as bridge between communities that had been taught to view each other as irredeemable enemies deserving no mercy or consideration. The conversations he conducted with former friends and neighbors revealed the depth of their sense of personal betrayal that went beyond mere tactical surprise to encompass existential questions about identity and loyalty that challenged fundamental assumptions about racial solidarity and cultural obligation that had been central to their understanding of proper behavior in circumstances where survival often required choosing sides rather than attempting neutrality. Their accusations that he'd sold his soul for Apache gold were painful because they contained elements of truth about moral compromises that had been necessary for survival, but couldn't be defended through rational arguments about practical necessity or abstract justice. The negotiations for prisoner release that followed weeks of careful diplomacy required Apache leaders to balance their desire for tactical advantage against understanding that excessive brutality would provoke federal responses that could destroy their communities through overwhelming force that was already being assembled in response to successful raids that had demonstrated indigenous military capabilities beyond anything territorial authorities had prepared to counter. The prisoners' value as bargaining chips was limited by federal policy that officially prohibited negotiations with hostile Indians while secretly encouraging local commanders to arrange unofficial exchanges that would recover American captives without formal recognition of Apache sovereignty or legitimacy. But the most complex aspect of the prisoner situation was Lucien's growing realization that his former neighbor's fate would be determined by political calculations that treated human lives as expendable resources in conflicts where both sides had committed atrocities that violated every principle of civilized warfare while justifying continued violence through historical grievances that couldn't be resolved through peaceful means. The choice between advocating for prisoner releases that would demonstrate Apache mercy or supporting continued detention that would provide leverage for future negotiations placed him in impossible positions where any decision would result in suffering for people whose only crime was living in territories where competing claims to sovereignty had made warfare inevitable regardless of individual intentions or desires for peaceful coexistence. The Grand War Council that convened to decide the future of Apache resistance brought together chiefs from bands that had been fighting independent campaigns throughout the territory. Their presence in the same canyon marking recognition that coordinated action was necessary for survival against federal forces whose strength was growing through reinforcements and improved tactics that were beginning to counter indigenous advantages in mobility and terrain knowledge. Lucien's intelligence about territorial military capabilities was crucial for strategic planning that would determine whether scattered Apache groups could unite effectively, or would be defeated separately through campaigns that exploited their isolation from each other and from potential allies among other tribes. The debates that followed revealed fundamental disagreements among Apache leaders about whether continued warfare was sustainable, given federal resources that seemed unlimited compared to indigenous capabilities that had been decimated by decades of conflict and forced relocation that had disrupted traditional social structures and economic systems. The younger warriors favored escalation that would force decisive confrontations, while older chiefs advocated strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions where Apache communities could survive long enough for political changes that might create opportunities for negotiated settlements rather than military solutions that favored whoever possessed superior numbers and industrial capacity. Lucien's recommendations about territorial vulnerabilities and federal military doctrine were received with respect that reflected his proven value as intelligence asset. But his suggestions about potential negotiations were dismissed by leaders whose experience with white promises had taught them that American authorities only honored agreements when enforcement was guaranteed through superior force rather than mutual trust or legal obligation. The historical record of treaty violations and reservation conditions had convinced most Apache leaders that survival required military victory rather than diplomatic compromise, making peace negotiations appear to be delaying tactics that would allow federal forces to strengthen their positions while indigenous peoples weakened themselves through hope for solutions that white politicians had no intention of implementing honestly. The strategic plan that emerged from the council emphasized hit-and-run tactics that would disrupt territorial commerce and communications, while avoiding pitched battles that would favor federal advantages in equipment and training. But the campaign's success would depend on maintaining unity among Apache bands, whose traditional autonomy made coordinated action difficult to sustain over extended periods when immediate tribal interests might conflict with broader strategic objectives. Lucien's role in implementing the plan required him to serve as liaison between different groups, while continuing to provide intelligence about territorial responses that would determine whether Apache forces could maintain their operational tempo or would be forced into defensive positions, where federal advantages would eventually prove decisive. But the most significant outcome of the War Council was Chief Nalnish's decision to make Lucien's marriage to Aiyana a formal political alliance that would demonstrate Apache willingness to incorporate useful allies, regardless of their ethnic background, while simultaneously ensuring his permanent commitment to indigenous cause through family bonds that couldn't be abandoned without dishonoring relationships that were considered sacred by traditional Apache culture. The ceremony that would transform their practical partnership into spiritual union carried implications that went far beyond personal feelings to encompass political statements about Apache sovereignty and cultural values that contradicted federal assumptions about racial hierarchy and assimilation policies that were designed to eliminate indigenous identity through forced adoption of white customs and beliefs. The Apache wedding ceremony that formalized Lucien and Aiyana's marriage according to traditional customs was conducted in the presence of chiefs who'd gathered from across the territory. Their participation in the ritual marking recognition that their union represented more than personal choice to encompass political alliance between white convert and indigenous community that was willing to accept outsiders whose loyalty had been proven through sacrifice and demonstrated commitment to Apache survival. The sacred nature of the vows they exchanged was emphasized by spiritual elements that connected their relationship to natural forces and ancestral spirits whose blessing was necessary for marriages that would produce children capable of bridging cultural differences while maintaining connection to traditional Apache values. The gifts presented by various bands represented acceptance of Lucien as warrior, whose worth was measured by contributions to collective security rather than ethnic heritage that had previously excluded white people from participation in Apache society, except as enemies or captives whose fate was determined by military necessity rather than personal merit. The weapons, horses, and sacred objects he received were symbols of trust that carried obligations for protecting Apache interests, even when such loyalty required actions that violated white moral codes and legal principles that he'd been raised to consider absolute and non-negotiable truth rather than cultural constructs that served particular political purposes. The celebration that followed the ceremony included performances and competitions that demonstrated Apache cultural richness that contradicted white stereotypes about indigenous peoples as primitive savages whose elimination was justified by their inability to utilize natural resources efficiently or maintain civilized social institutions. The complexity of Apache political structures, artistic traditions, and spiritual beliefs was revealed through ceremonial activities that had been perfected over centuries of cultural development that had been disrupted but not destroyed by military campaigns designed to eliminate indigenous resistance through cultural genocide as well as physical destruction. Aiyana's transformation from intelligence operative to traditional Apache wife was marked by rituals that restored her connection to cultural identity that had been suppressed during her infiltration mission among white settlers who'd accepted her Spanish persona while remaining ignorant of her true heritage and purpose. Her relief at abandoning the psychological strain of maintaining false identity was evident in her participation in traditional women's activities that connected her to community roles that were respected and valued rather than merely tolerated as necessary evils in warfare that required distasteful but essential contributions from people whose gender made them unsuitable for direct combat but uniquely qualified for intelligence operations. But the most profound aspect of their union was the spiritual dimension that connected their personal relationship to larger questions about cultural survival and adaptation that would determine whether Apache peoples could maintain their identity while incorporating useful elements from other cultures that might strengthen their capacity for resistance against federal policies designed to eliminate indigenous communities through assimilation or extermination. Their marriage represented hope that love could transcend racial boundaries while preserving cultural values that were essential for maintaining Apache identity in circumstances where survival required both military resistance and cultural adaptation that balanced tradition with practical necessity for change that would enable continued existence as distinct peoples, rather than disappeared remnants of civilizations that white progress had relegated to historical curiosity. The coordinated Apache offensive that began in spring represented the culmination of strategic planning that had been developing since the War Council, with simultaneous attacks across the territory designed to demonstrate indigenous military capabilities while disrupting federal supply lines and communications networks that sustained white settlement in regions where civilian populations depended on military protection for survival against hostile forces that had been dramatically underestimated by territorial authorities whose racial prejudices had prevented accurate assessment of enemy strengths and tactical sophistication. Lucien's role in the campaign required him to lead mixed units of Apache warriors and converted settlers whose combined knowledge of white and indigenous military techniques created tactical advantages that neither group could have achieved independently, their success demonstrating possibilities for cultural integration that transcended ethnic boundaries while maintaining distinct identity groups whose cooperation was based on mutual respect rather than forced assimilation that had characterized previous federal policies toward indigenous peoples. The victories they achieved through coordinated action proved that racial diversity could strengthen rather than weaken military organizations when differences were utilized strategically rather than suppressed through artificial uniformity. The siege of Fort Mason represented the largest military operation attempted by Apache forces since the beginning of territorial conflicts. with success dependent on maintaining coordination among hundreds of warriors whose traditional autonomy made such large-scale cooperation difficult to sustain when immediate tribal interests might conflict with broader strategic objectives that required individual sacrifice for collective benefit. Lucien's intelligence about federal defensive capabilities enabled Apache commanders to design attacks that bypassed strong points while exploiting weaknesses that wouldn't have been apparent to leaders whose understanding of white military doctrine was limited to battlefield observation rather than intimate knowledge of training and tactical principles. The psychological impact of Apache victories throughout the territory was amplified by federal inability to mount effective counterattacks against enemy forces whose mobility and terrain knowledge made traditional military responses ineffective, while indigenous intelligence networks provided early warning about federal troop movements that enabled tactical withdrawals when circumstances favored enemy advantages in numbers and equipment. The success of Apache resistance encouraged other tribes to reconsider their own accommodation with federal authority, creating possibilities for broader indigenous alliance that might challenge American expansion more effectively than isolated tribal campaigns that could be defeated separately through superior federal resources. But the most significant consequence of Apache military success was federal decision to escalate conflicts through total war policies that targeted indigenous civilians as well as warriors, with orders for extermination campaigns that would eliminate Apache resistance through genocide that was justified by racial ideologies that denied indigenous humanity while portraying white settlement as civilizing mission that improved territories through agricultural development and commercial activity. The arrival of federal reinforcements with explicit orders to show no mercy to hostile Indians or their white allies marked transition from limited territorial conflict to ethnic warfare that would determine whether Apache peoples could survive as distinct cultural community or would be eliminated through systematic slaughter that treated men, women, and children as equally dangerous enemies whose existence threatened American progress and security. The news of General Sherman's appointment to command territorial operations brought fear that went beyond normal military concerns to encompass existential terror about federal policies that had been escalated from containment to extermination through orders that explicitly authorized total war against Apache peoples who would be given no opportunity for surrender or negotiation that might preserve their communities through accommodation with American authority. Sherman's reputation for conducting campaigns that deliberately targeted civilian populations was well known among Apache leaders, whose intelligence networks had provided detailed information about his tactics during conflicts with other tribes that had been eliminated through systematic destruction of food sources, shelter, and non-combatant populations whose survival was essential for cultural continuity. The federal buildup that accompanied Sherman's arrival included thousands of troops whose training and equipment represented the latest developments in military technology and tactics. Their presence in the territory marking federal commitment to resolving Apache resistance through overwhelming force that would make continued indigenous military action impossible regardless of tactical advantages that had enabled previous victories against smaller federal forces led by commanders whose understanding of Indian warfare had been limited by conventional military doctrine that was inadequate for frontier conditions. The new federal strategy emphasized pursuit and destruction rather than defensive protection of white settlements, making Apache mobility advantages less valuable when every movement was tracked by scout units whose knowledge of indigenous tactics had been improved through captured prisoners and converted warriors. The Council of War that convened to address the federal threat revealed divisions among Apache leaders whose previous unity had been based on successful resistance that was no longer sustainable against enemy forces whose numbers and resources exceeded anything territorial authorities had previously committed to Indian campaigns. The younger chiefs favored continued resistance despite overwhelming odds, while older leaders advocated strategic withdrawal to Mexico, where Apache communities might survive long enough for political changes that could create opportunities for return to traditional territories under negotiated agreements that would preserve cultural identity, if not political independence. Lucien's assessment of federal capabilities was grimmer than even the most pessimistic Apache estimates. His intimate knowledge of white military culture, revealing aspects of American determination that went beyond territorial conquest to encompass ideological commitment to racial supremacy that made compromise impossible regardless of military costs or humanitarian concerns that might limit violence in conflicts between civilized opponents. The federal campaign was designed to eliminate Apache peoples rather than simply defeat Apache resistance, making survival dependent on total victory that was probably impossible given resource disparities that favored American forces in any prolonged conflict that couldn't be ended through decisive indigenous success in battles that would force federal withdrawal from territorial operations. But the most devastating intelligence that Lucien provided concerned federal willingness to use Apache captives as hostages, whose execution would be threatened unless resistance ended immediately. With Sherman's explicit orders that included provisions for hanging prisoners in groups of 50 until Apache leaders surrendered unconditionally or their communities were destroyed through systematic slaughter that would eliminate genetic and cultural continuity, regardless of how many warriors escaped to continue fighting from Mexican sanctuary. The moral dimensions of resistance became complicated when continued warfare meant certain death for hundreds of Apache women and children whose lives would be forfeit if military operations continued, making surrender seem like the only option that might preserve enough Apache people to maintain cultural survival even under reservation conditions that were designed to eliminate indigenous identity through forced assimilation and cultural suppression. The decision to make their final stand at Devil's Canyon was influenced by spiritual considerations as well as tactical advantages. The location's sacred significance to Apache peoples, making it appropriate place for battles that might determine whether their culture would survive or be eliminated through military defeat, that would scatter survivors across reservations where traditional ways of life would be systematically destroyed through federal policies designed to assimilate indigenous peoples into white society. The canyon's defensive advantages were formidable, but not overwhelming, requiring Apache warriors to fight with desperation that came from understanding that retreat was impossible when federal forces were numerous enough to pursue and destroy any survivors who attempted to escape through terrain that offered concealment but limited opportunities for sustained resistance. The siege that followed Sherman's arrival demonstrated federal determination to eliminate Apache resistance through tactics that violated conventional rules of warfare by targeting civilian populations and cultural sites, whose destruction was designed to break indigenous morale while eliminating symbols and resources that sustained traditional Apache identity. The bombardment of sacred areas and deliberate destruction of food caches and water sources revealed American commitment to genocide that went beyond military victory to encompass cultural extermination that would prevent Apache recovery even if some individuals survived the immediate conflict through flight or surrender to federal authorities whose mercy was limited to preservation of life rather than respect for cultural continuity. Lucien's role in the defense required him to utilize his knowledge of federal tactics to predict and counter American operations. But his intelligence advantages were offset by overwhelming federal superiority in numbers and equipment that made prolonged resistance impossible, despite tactical innovations that had enabled previous Apache victories against smaller and less determined federal forces. The precision with which federal artillery targeted Apache positions demonstrated that Sherman's forces included scouts and advisors whose knowledge of indigenous defensive techniques enabled effective countermeasures that neutralized traditional Apache advantages in mobility and terrain utilization. The casualties that mounted during days of continuous fighting included many of the warriors whose leadership had sustained Apache resistance throughout years of territorial warfare, their deaths eliminating military expertise and cultural knowledge that couldn't be replaced quickly enough to maintain organized opposition against federal forces whose resources seemed unlimited compared to indigenous capabilities that had been stretched beyond sustainable limits. The women and children who died during federal bombardments represented not just immediate human tragedy, but long-term cultural catastrophe that would make Apache recovery impossible even if military resistance somehow succeeded in forcing federal withdrawal from territorial operations. But the most heartbreaking aspect of the siege was watching Apache social structures collapse under pressure that exceeded anything their traditional culture had prepared them to handle, with family bonds and community relationships being destroyed by circumstances that forced impossible choices between individual survival and collective responsibility. The decision to send children and elderly people toward Mexican territory while warriors continued fighting represented acknowledgement that military victory was impossible, but cultural survival might still be achievable if enough Apache people escaped to maintain traditional ways of life in exile until political changes created opportunities for return to ancestral territories under conditions that preserved indigenous identity and autonomy. The federal assault that broke Apache resistance came at dawn on the 10th day of siege, with Sherman's forces overwhelming defensive positions through coordinated attacks that utilized superior numbers and firepower to eliminate indigenous advantages that had been based on intimate knowledge of terrain and traditional tactical methods that were inadequate against enemy forces, whose training and equipment represented the latest developments in military technology. The battle that followed was characterized by desperate courage on both sides, but federal victory was inevitable once Apache ammunition was exhausted and defensive positions were compromised by artillery bombardment that had made continued resistance impossible despite indigenous determination to fight until death rather than surrender to enemies whose mercy was uncertain and whose treatment of prisoners had been brutal throughout territorial campaigns. Lucien's capture during the final assault was accompanied by wounds that would have been fatal without immediate medical attention that federal forces provided only because Sherman wanted information about Apache leadership and remaining resistance capabilities that might threaten continued federal operations in territories where indigenous peoples had demonstrated tactical sophistication that exceeded American estimates of Indian military potential. The interrogation that followed his capture was conducted by officers whose professional respect for his tactical knowledge was balanced by personal hatred for white men who'd betrayed their race through collaboration with savage enemies whose elimination was considered necessary for civilized progress and territorial development. The trial that determined his fate was conducted according to military law that provided minimal protection for traitors whose crimes included providing intelligence to hostile Indians and participating in raids against federal installations and civilian settlements throughout territories where his local knowledge had enabled Apache victories that had cost American lives and delayed territorial pacification. The evidence against him was overwhelming and undeniable, while his defense was limited to explanations about circumstances that had forced choices between collaboration and death, arguments that carried no legal weight with courts that were more interested in making examples than examining moral complexities of frontier conflicts, where survival often required compromising principles that seemed absolute until tested by extreme circumstances. Aiyana's presence at his trial provided emotional support that was complicated by understanding that her own fate would be determined by federal policies toward captured Indians whose treatment ranged from reservation imprisonment to summary execution, depending on their perceived threat to territorial security and their potential value as examples that would discourage continued resistance among indigenous peoples who hadn't yet been defeated through military action. Her pregnancy with their child added urgency to negotiations that might preserve their lives while demonstrating federal mercy, that could be used for propaganda purposes that portrayed American authority as just and humane, despite military campaigns that had been characterized by systematic brutality against civilian populations. The sentence that was pronounced reflected federal determination to eliminate white collaboration with hostile Indians through punishments that would discourage future cooperation between racial enemies whose alliance represented existential threat to American expansion and territorial security. But the execution was delayed pending appeals that provided opportunities for political intervention that might commute death sentences to life imprisonment if circumstances changed, and mercy seemed more valuable than martyrdom for propaganda purposes. As Lucien awaited his fate in federal custody, while Aiyana was transported to reservation where their child would be born into captivity, both understood that their love had been tested by history and found strong enough to survive everything that politics and warfare could inflict on people whose only crime had been loving each other across racial boundaries that society considered absolute and non-negotiable barriers to legitimate relationships. 20 years after the Apache Wars had ended with Chief Nalnish's death, and the relocation of surviving Apache peoples to reservations in distant territories, Lucien Moreau had become a legend throughout the Southwest, not as the traitor who'd betrayed his own people, but as the bridge builder whose life had demonstrated that love could transcend racial boundaries while honoring the best values of both cultures. He'd served during conflicts that had consumed too many lives, without resolving fundamental questions about justice, sovereignty, and the possibility of peaceful coexistence between different peoples sharing the same land. His sentence had been commuted to life in territorial prison after appeals that had attracted national attention to questions about military justice and the treatment of white men who'd been forced to choose between death and collaboration with indigenous peoples whose resistance to American expansion had been characterized by both legitimate grievances and brutal tactics that violated conventional rules of warfare. The political controversy surrounding his case had eventually led to his release after serving 12 years of hard labor that had broken his health but strengthened his resolve to build something positive from the tragedy that had claimed so many lives on both sides of conflicts that had been inevitable given competing claims to territory and resources. The school he'd established for Apache children was funded by donations from Eastern philanthropists, whose consciences had been troubled by accounts of federal campaigns that had eliminated indigenous resistance through methods that violated American principles of justice and humanitarian treatment of defeated enemies. His teaching emphasized cultural preservation alongside practical education that would enable Apache youth to navigate white society while maintaining connection to traditional values and knowledge that were essential for community survival in circumstances where federal policies continued to target indigenous identity for elimination through forced assimilation and cultural suppression. Aiyana's work as cultural liaison between reservation officials and Apache communities had been crucial for maintaining peace during the difficult transition from warfare to accommodation that required both sides to abandon positions that had seemed absolute and non-negotiable during years of conflict that had been characterized by mutual hatred and distrust. Her ability to explain Apache perspectives to white authorities while helping her people understand federal policies had prevented misunderstandings that might have led to renewed violence, while her marriage to Lucien had become symbol of possibilities for cooperation that transcended racial animosity through personal relationships based on mutual respect rather than cultural dominance. Their children had grown up as living bridges between two worlds, equally comfortable in Apache and white societies, while belonging completely to neither, their unique position enabling them to serve as translators and mediators whose work would be essential for healing wounds that had been inflicted during decades of warfare that had damaged both indigenous and white communities throughout the territorial period. The love story that had begun with deception and betrayal had evolved into foundation for reconciliation that proved redemption was possible even for people whose choices had caused suffering that couldn't be undone, but might be forgiven through acknowledgement of shared humanity that was more important than racial differences that had been used to justify conflicts whose resolution required courage to love across boundaries that society had constructed to maintain separation between peoples whose cooperation was essential for building futures that honored the best traditions of both cultures while creating new possibilities for harmony that had seemed impossible during the darkest years of territorial warfare. The cowboy who'd married for land had discovered that the greatest inheritance was love that was strong enough to survive everything that history could inflict on people brave enough to choose each other over safety, understanding over prejudice, and hope over despair in circumstances where such choices required sacrificing everything except the bonds that made life worth living, regardless of what price others demanded for the privilege of loving across lines that were drawn by politics but erased by human hearts that recognized no boundaries except those created by conscience and sustained by commitment to values that transcended race, culture, and every other artificial division that separated people who shared the same dreams of happiness, security, and meaning in lives that were too brief and precious to waste on hatred that served no purpose except to prevent the love that was the only force capable of healing wounds that warfare had inflicted on communities whose survival depended on learning to live together rather than continuing to die apart.